Now, we've talked a lot about fake news, and you had some stuff on Section 230, which, of course, impacts whether or not you're allowed to publish fake news on the internet and how that should be policed. Did you want to throw that up there, Eric?
Yeah, I actually have the content of Trump's executive order regarding the Section 230, which I thought was really interesting because this is something that should have been, and it was for a little bit. It was big news for a little bit, but then, the news cycle obviously kind of, moved on with everything else that's been happening. And this is something that can have major repercussions for how the internet is utilized in the future. And it's a really interesting order. I'm going to make sure that I include this in the YouTube version of the show, so that if people want to look at the actual text of the executive order, they're able to do that. But it's very interesting because if you kind of get down to the meat of this and sort of the the enforcement section, if you will, of this. So it says protecting federal taxpayer dollars from financing online platforms that restrict free speech. It says that the head of each executive department agency shall review its agency's federal spending on advertising and marketing paid to online platforms. Such reviews shall include the amount of money spent, the online platforms that receive federal dollars, and the statutory authorities available to restrict their receipt of advertising dollars. That's a pretty interesting thing. I haven't heard anybody talk about that.
No, I haven't, but it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
It makes perfect sense to me, anyway.
Because you have the military, like you think about the Marines or the Army, they have recruitment advertisements probably on Facebook. I mean, normally I see them on TV or something like that. But why, if these platforms are acting in a way that we feel is un-American or not in keeping with our values, should we be advertising on them? I mean, we would not want, say, the military advertising on the Chinese TikTok platform, for example, because obviously that's a Chinese owned and it's it's part of their spy apparatus, and so we don't want to support that. I'm not saying that the government should be cracking down on any of these organizations. I'm not saying that the federal government should be trying to restrict Facebook or Twitter from operating in the way that they want to. But when it comes to our tax dollars, obviously, we should not be supporting censorship.
No, and it's interesting. This executive order references China numerous times as well, which is also interesting. And of course, China does engage. I mean, there's no denying that China engages in deceptive practices on the internet, and they're able to get away with it in large part because of money, because they're able to pay for ads and basically put the content on there that they want. And it's a fact that many of these big tech companies have been helping China in many of their programs, particularly with social credits and things like that. That's not conspiracy. That's a fact. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's very dystopian. Yeah, your ability to get on a train, your ability to go to the store, or whatever it is you want to do, move around your town, is affected by the score that the Chinese state has given you. Are you a good citizen or a bad citizen? You have more rights if you're a good citizen, meaning you're compliant, and you have fewer rights if you don't. To kind of switch gears here a little bit, because there's quite a bit of controversy though over Section 230, and I think that part of the executive order we're all on board with. But the part that's kind of controversial is, if you could throw it up, I have it on the other screen here. Thank you. This is Justin Amash has put out a number of tweets, but this one was I thought summed it up the best. Who said, "Who originally the false claim that an entity is exclusively a publisher or a platform under Section 230 with different liability depending on the type of entity. 95% of the confusion on this subject stems from the misstatement of the law." And I think he's absolutely hit the nail on the head here. Obviously, he's not the biggest fan of Trump. He's the only, a former Republican now, who voted to impeach the president. And he is a lawyer. So he does know, when he starts talking about the law, especially this type of law, I think he knows exactly what he's talking about. It just makes sense. If you owned a bar, okay, this is the analogy I've sort of had incubating, is if you have a bar, you don't want people dealing drugs inside of your bar, probably, because that's not the kind of clientele you want to have. But if you apply the logic of Section 230, or at least this understanding of Section 230, if you start kicking people out because they're dealing drugs or doing something else that's unsavory, illegal, what have you, then you are responsible for everything that anybody does in your bar. Well, that's obviously crazy, right? Because you may not know what everybody in your bar or restaurant or whatever is doing. And if you scale this up to something like Twitter or Facebook, Twitter and Facebook have no idea what many people are doing. And a lot of people say, oh, it's unfair, and the way the policies are applied is unfair. And I absolutely agree with that. Of course it's unfair. They view conservative or right-wing harassment to be more of a threat than left-wing harassment. So if you're right of center, if you're a conservative and you violate their policies or are perceived to have violated their policies, they're going to crack down on you, even if it's very obviously a joke, for example. So not a true threat, which is what a lot of these boil down to. Whereas if Kathy Griffin makes a joke about wanting to inject the president with a needle, so to kill him because you inject him with a needle with air, that will kill you. Now, is she really going to do that? Is that a true threat? Well, it's not. She's a comedian. But Carl Benjamin, who is a political commentator, but he does it in a comic way. It's funny. People understand. He is telling jokes for the most part. He was banned from Twitter for joking about throwing somebody out of a helicopter, which was a reference to something that happened in Chile back in the 1970s. So when conservatives make jokes, we get kicked off the platform. When liberals make jokes, hey, it's just a joke, man. It's not fair. And the thinking is, well, that means they're not entitled to Section 230 protection. I would say, actually, the court cases that led up to Section 230 being put in place were simply wrong-headed. If you think about the logic of holding a platform that allows people to publish stuff, right? They may have policies, but they can't be 100% gatekeepers. They can't be certain nobody will ever publish something bad on their platform, because if they did, they would have to moderate everything, which means that when you try to publish a tweet, it's going to take at least, I don't know, an hour, a day to get published. So it's not even real time anymore. Is that the kind of world we want to live in, where we regulate these social media companies so strictly that social media ceases to be social? Because I think
I'm not sure how social it actually is anymore, to be honest with you, Pete. I like to call it anti-social media.
Well, I think there's something to that. Because obviously there is still a lot of harassment on social media, but the fact is it is real time. We had a conversation with Senator Ted Cruz the other day on Twitter, where we got 600 views on Twitter. That's the kind of power that anybody can have right now in social media. But if it's no longer live, you won't have that kind of dynamic. If it's no longer live, then suddenly the kind of conversations that we're having in real time with people all over the world, we were talking about the space shuttle earlier this week. Isn't it amazing? We can all enjoy this moment together. Well, how can you have that if social media has to slow down to have every single thing moderated? What I would like to see is, people always talk about the algorithms, how the algorithms are bad and wrong. I would like to see algorithms that try to optimize these platforms for maximum traffic and access. Because if you have a big audience, if people are going to your site, that means that it must be something that people actually like. Isn't that, that's pretty objective, right? And yet that's not how they do it. They do have a lot of human moderation of these comments. And
apparently they have much less of that because of COVID-19. In fact, I just did a complaint on somebody's comment because I thought they were inciting violence. And the message that I got back immediately from Twitter was, yeah, we've got less people monitoring this stuff, so good luck with that, essentially. You know what I mean? I'm paraphrasing. But yeah. I want to get back to Section 230 real quick. I also want to acknowledge Zach again, because he did agree with me that it is anti-social media. So, hey, when I get some public backing, I've got to use it. And he says it's interesting that the only people who get blocked are those with a big platform. That's an interesting observation, Zachary, because I've had that observation as well. That obviously a lot of people say really threatening things, but because they don't have a lot of followers, they don't get flagged. The algorithm never picks them up. I've noticed that as well, which I think is interesting.
And I suppose you're going to have fewer people reporting them, but it does work in favor. And not only people who are small platforms, but if you're publishing in a foreign language, that's going to be harder for Twitter or these platforms to filter. So groups like ISIS and Al Qaeda, it's actually easier for them to fly under the radar than it is for somebody who's an American talk show host or the U.S. president. To fly under the radar on these policies.
Yeah, that does make sense, although it does also show that the algorithm is clearly flawed, because if the algorithm worked, it would just flag everybody, and it doesn't. So I wanted to bring up Section 230 specifically, and this is from Cornell Law School. This is the actual text. 40, and it says findings. So what's interesting about this is basically telling you the intent of the law. This is why the law is in place in the why. And it tells you right here. So it says, number one, the rapidly developing array of internet and other interactive computer services available to individual Americans represent an extraordinary advance in the ability of educational and informational resources to our citizens. Two, these services offer users a great degree of control over the information that they receive, as well as the potential for even greater control in the future as technology develops. Three, the internet and other interactive computer services offer a forum for a true diversity of political discourse, unique opportunities for cultural development, and myriad avenues for intellectual activity. This is the section that I want to focus on here, because it's very clear what the intent there, where they're coming from. It says, the internet and other interactive computer services offer a forum for a true diversity of political discourse. I don't know how much more black and white you can make it, because when you look at a law and the interpretation of a law, I've always been taught, I think this is going away more and more every day, but you're supposed to look at the intent of the law, not just the actual verbiage of the law, but why it is that they made that law in the first place. And here in black and white is at least part of why they did. There are additional sections to this.
Now, who produced this?
This is from Cornell University. This is the actual text of the 47 U.S. Code 230. This is the text of the code. This is just the straight text of the code.
This is the intent, I mean, who is interpreting the intent here is my question.
Congress. These are the findings of Congress. This is the background for why they passed the law. When they pass a section like this, and I realize people don't read these sections. There are tons and tons of federal sections of laws and titles and codes. So obviously this is Title 47 and it's Section 230. That's why we say Section 230. It's Section 230 of Title 47 of the U.S. Code. This is the actual text of the law. It's similar to like when you see the emergency declarations and they say, whereas blah, 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 whereas blah, 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 whereas blah, blah, blah. They provide a context and basically tell you why this order is being put to effect. Well, they do the same thing with laws. And this is an example of that. So it tells you there that this was part of the intent of the law, was that they understood that the internet should be and had this incredible potential to be a forum, quote, for a true diversity of political discourse. And I think what a lot of the frustration is when it comes to what the internet companies are doing right now is this platform publisher debate, if you will. It's not specifically said in the law. They don't identify a platform. They do talk about publishers, but they don't. But that's the interpretation, because people understand what the intent was. And the intent, in my mind, of Section 230 was to basically, first of all, it has a lot to do with actual child protection and sexual exploitation of minors. there is a big part of that involved with Section 230. They wanted to make sure that data mining didn't happen and things like that. So there's a huge element of that. But the other part of Section 230 was to allow the internet to be treated as a medium, to be treated as a way of communicating, and to not treat these particular entities, these service providers, they didn't want to treat them as publishers. That's the idea. That's the intent. That's the easiest way to understand it. They wanted to make sure that they were considered to be a platform, that they were considered to be something like, I saw somebody do a post on Twitter that I thought was really interesting, where he said, think about if you were basically had to be fact checked when you were using the phone, if you had to be fact checked, every time that you sent a letter, you know what I mean? That, I think that is actually a very good way to think about it. And Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all these different anti-social media platforms, they need to think, do I want to be the mail? Do I want to be a phone? Or do I want to be Simon & Schuster? Do I want to be HBO? Do I want to be Disney Plus? Who are you? And as a society, we have to decide that as well. This is, I think, is a relevant debate.
Well, they are to some degree a little bit of both, and that's what's really interesting. And that's why these laws. I think a lot of these lawsuits are, frankly, a lot of these questions have been solved just in other contexts. So again, to go back to Justin Amash, he says Twitter's not immune from being sued for defamatory content it creates. This argument by Donald Trump and his Senate defenders about Section 230 that Twitter can't be sued for defamation is false. It is treated the same as CNN. I think that's a really interesting point, because you have these platforms that are sort of a hybrid, that they are producing some content, but a lot of the content is auto-generated. And so his point is, what Twitter says they should be held responsible for things they don't say they should not be held responsible for, which is just common sense. Whether or not Section 230 exists, it is kind of mind-blowing that any court thought that it was proper to hold these platforms responsible for content that they did not create. That they weren't necessarily aware of, that they didn't moderate. And I guess the thinking is, if you have, say...
I want to point that out, that's kind of where the publisher thing comes from. Because it's to me, it's the easiest way to explain how the system actually works. Because if you're a publisher, you don't necessarily create the content either. As a publisher, you're not the author, right? There's a difference. And that's why words matter. So if you're a publisher, that doesn't mean you like Simon & Schuster. They didn't write the book. An author wrote that book, right? They are simply the publisher, but they are still held liable as the publisher. That's the difference. That's when it comes to, because this stuff gets really complicated. When you talk about things like entertainment law and intellectual property and all that kind of stuff, which is really a great deal of what we're talking about here. It gets very complicated. And Section 230 was a specific protection for internet service providers and internet providers of various kinds. And it has shielded YouTube and Twitter. And think about YouTube. YouTube would be knocked out of existence if they were actually held to that standard as a publisher of all the copyrighted material that gets put on YouTube constantly, which they're constantly also trying to take down. But that's probably the best example I can give is they would go out of business in 5 minutes if they were held liable for all that pirated content that's put on their platform.
Right. Yeah, and they do try to take down pirated content, and I don't think any sane person objects to them doing that. Right? We want them to take down pirated content because somebody had to pay to produce that.
Do we? Because I know a lot of people that love that pirated content, and that's why they went to YouTube in the first place.
There's an audience for it. Yeah, there's an audience for it. But just as we don't want people dealing drugs in your bar, just as we don't want people. So here's a very clear example where Backpage.com was shut down, put out of business in large part because of Kamala Harris and other thugs who misused the law. Backpage.com was trying to be just a platform, but they did have rules. You weren't allowed to engage in human trafficking. No, not allowed to advertise for underage people engaging in non-consensual behavior, things like that. Right? They were trying to be good citizens and uphold the law, and they got absolutely railroaded because what would happen was they would set up filters that would look for inappropriate content, illegal services, let's say, on their website, and then people would figure out a way to get around it. They'd create a code to communicate to each other, and the code would just keep changing. And so what they eventually said was, okay, we're not going to micromanage this anymore. If people are going to do that, there's not a lot we can do. We've tried to make the rules, we've tried to moderate it, and people just keep getting around the rules, and it's just just on a treadmill. So what we're going to do is when the police say to us, hey, do you know who published this ad that is clearly code for something that is, illegal? It's an illegal ad. They would help them. They were more than willing to be an open book. Yes, we know exactly who published that ad. This is the credit card they use. This is who we think this person is. This is their IP address and where we think their location is. And they would help the police. But that wasn't enough. So the publishers, both these people from Phoenix, Arizona, were arrested now multiple times, and they've gotten out of jail and gone back, and it's a real mess. But basically, it comes down to this publisher platform distinction. The authorities want to hold them accountable for content that they did not produce and that they have made a good faith effort to moderate, but have not been able to moderate to the extent that we as a society or the police department would like to do, even to their own satisfaction. They were not able to moderate it. But to say then, okay, because you moderated the platform insufficiently, we're going to take away your protections or we're going to throw you in jail, to me is absolute madness. And it shows how these courts are out of control, how these prosecutors are out of control, because the internet is this new thing and we're acting like these are new questions. These are not new questions. Our legal system is approximately 1,000 years old now. We have asked questions about responsibility. If somebody is a contractor, for example, producing content for you, how much responsibility do you have for that? Well, it depends. It depends on how much oversight. It depends on if you could have foreseen that they were going to publish something that was inciting violence, whatever it is. We have asked these questions. They have been answered in court. Why isn't Chris Hansen arresting them? The police have made many arrests on the basis of information they've gotten from the Backpage.com corporation. Chris Hansen didn't have to get involved, but yeah, the founders of the Phoenix New Times and Backpage.com, which was a spinoff, they did help put many people who were hurting young girls in prison, and they gave money to a shelter to help people who were trapped in that lifestyle get out of that lifestyle. So, oh goodness. I don't have any information about that, Zachary. I would have to learn more about that. But that is a gray area, isn't it? If you are entrapping people, what are the ethics and what are the legalities of that? I'm not entirely sure. But
I can say off the top of my head, I can say off the top of my head, I don't think there is such a thing as entrapment for someone unless they are directly working with law enforcement. In other words, it's the government agent test is the easiest way I can explain it. It's the same thing like when you talk about an illegal search. I always like to use the Batman analogy. So if Batman goes and searches in a criminal's lair and finds something that's incriminating and gives it to the police all on his own, theoretically that could still be used in court. But if Commissioner Gordon tells Batman to go into the crook's lair and take some evidence because they can't get it, now he's a government agent, and that becomes what they call fruit of the poisonous tree. And I think that's the same thing with entrapment, because entrapment obviously is just another form of evidence. So those are kind of the ways that the rules of evidence work. So if you're in the case of Chris Hansen, right, he was working as a journalist, right, doing To Catch a Predator and things like that. And as long as he wasn't quote unquote a government agent, or working on behalf of a government entity as a quote unquote government agent, the rules are different. Does that make sense? So,
yeah, that makes sense to me.
yeah. I don't know if that's the case with Chris Hansen, by the way. I don't claim to be an expert on it. I'm just saying that general principle I would think would apply to him, just as it would apply to any journalist who isn't quote unquote working for a law enforcement entity. He's not working for the government. You know what I mean? So,
yeah, I haven't heard that there's any investigation into him on in regards to that. But yeah, well, he's something of a controversial figure. Well, we're kind of hitting the our break here, the end of our time. Is there anything you'd like to add before we sign off, Eric?
well, I did want to say thank you, Zachary, and thank you, NC Fisherman. And I think we even had another one, but I just want to thank you guys for commenting and being part of the show today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, so do I. Well, my name is Pete Maines. As always, I'm here with my co-host Eric Alexander. And until next week, you guys keep flying free.